The Kiros Report is thrilled to bring Jim Paul, a renowned American scholar who has been at this work for many, many years, educated at Harvard University, Oxford University, New York University, and then working as a professor, first an assistant professor at the State University of New York, I believe between 1972 and 1977. And since then, he has worked as editor-in-chief of the prestigious Middle East Research Project, and also worked as an independent writer and editor of the equally prestigious Oxford University Press's companion to Politics. He could pride himself, exemplified in his 40-page long bio, that he has published about 150 articles in journals, magazines, and newspapers. He has also lectured widely, globally, I think about 200 times or so. What an honor to bring Jim Paul to the Kiros Report for the first time to dissect for us the tragic condition in the Middle East, which has given us perpetual wars, most particularly the war which has lasted for about 15 months with the deaths of 46,000 Palestinians and probably about 210 wounded Palestinians. And when we uncover the rabble, the number might just as easily be twice that. The great European thinker Hegel contended liberation, may I add, the liberation of the people is a perpetual project. It is a kind of project that one must earn by tragic means, for example, wars, since it can't be earned naturally. Jim Paul will give us an objective dissection of the politics of the axis of resistance, which will be unlike what my viewers are conditioned to listen to, namely the highly prejudiced and conditioned analysis that the American news media and some parts of the global media have been treating us to. Welcome to the Kiros Report for the first time. Professor
Well,
Jim.
Tedros, thank you very much. It's a great honor, of course, to be with you today. And I think it's a day that is especially interesting since there appears to be some political movement. We'll have to talk about how much movement and whether it's going to last. But in any event, the world's attention is after flagging after all these months and months and months of this terrible war. There is something going on. All right, so let's go. I thought about meeting with you today, and I'm very tempted to look back very briefly in the history of this particular area, because, as you well know, it has been fought over and contested by empires going way, way back. And when I was in Gaza a little while ago, I was staying in a hotel, and there was a column that was out in the garden outside the hotel, and that column was a Roman column. So we're reminded of the empires that have come and gone from this area. And I want to emphasize that this is about empire. The war that we have, we can, of course, dissect it and look at the different elements and interested parties, but it's really about a global empire of the United States. And it was about the Roman Empire, and before that, the Egyptians, the Egyptian pharaohs came, and then, of course, from the Middle East and the Fertile Crescent, those empires, the Babylonian Empire and Assyrians, they were battling over this place that is geostrategically connected to Africa, to Asia, and to Europe. And in our own time, it not only has this tremendous geostrategic importance, but it also has oil. And that is something that most people who talk about the crisis in the Middle East forget, predictably so. They forget about the oil, but the oil remains a central element of our understanding of the battles going on in the Middle East. And we, of course, don't forget that the greatest companies are located in the United States and also in Britain. It has a joint sort of a condominium over one of the big companies with the Netherlands, and another one is a French company. So we just happen to notice that the United States, the Netherlands, and France are particularly interested in this area and are constantly sending airplanes and weapons and so forth out there. Now, they're not doing it because of, Zionist pressures. Of course, there's Zionist pressures. We understand that. But they're doing it first and foremost because they're maintaining a rule over the world, yes. And I think we can talk about that, but I think that's scientifically undeniable. And that's where when we come to the present day, we have to discuss it. But of course, I'm glad to talk about the different political currents. First, and also recent empires that that have ruled over that area. So you tell me where you want to go.
That's excellent. I liked the way you just seamlessly intervened to my mind. Although philosophically speaking, it's almost impossible to enter another person's mind except through what Sheldrake calls morphic resonance, but that is far out there. It yet has to be empirically verified. But anyway, so what is remarkable about your project is the books that you have published. For example, Syria Unmasked, The War in Iraq, Chickens and Foxes, and Humanity Comes Out of Age. These are powerful titles and powerful books. So let us use some of the contents of these books and for the benefit of our viewers, let's talk about the axis of resistance. It's quite a captive name, but let's dissect it in terms of its geopolitical formation, since you have already handled Syria in Syria Unmasked.
Yes.
Iraq, the wars in Iraq, humanity coming out of age, which is the present tragic condition of human beings. So let's give a crash course, as it were, on what the axis of resistance is, who the participants are, what their motivational and organizational principles are, what their visions are, so forth and so on. Take your time and let's begin with a dissection of the axis of resistance.
Okay. Well, the axis of resistance is a fairly fluid phenomenon. It's a It's a reflection of popular resistance to empire. And we had, turning back in history, we had the various, recent history, I'm sorry, we had the various movements of the nationalist movements that were opposed, of course, to the Ottoman Empire immediately before World War I. But then after that came the British. And as, of course, we know, the Mr. Sykes and Mr. Picot were sent out by the British and French foreign offices during the war to set out the areas of interest, as they called it, of their each country had its colonial empire, and this was to expand those empires into the Middle East as the Ottoman Empire disappeared. And it's very useful to remember the Sykes-Picot Accord. Most people don't, of course, but this shows us, before the era when the United States became hegemonic in the region, it shows us exactly how the Western liberal countries approached the matter of governance and freedom and so forth in this area. They thought nothing of sitting down around a table and drawing lines through the map. Here, this is we'll take this part, you take that part, we'll argue about this, and so on. So, in other words, sovereignty over these territories was just something that they were bargaining over. And they're constantly, of course, talking about the rights of peoples to their, and Woodrow Wilson, of course, he was a big blatherer who liked to talk about the rights of people to independence. And he signed off on this. There was no problem with the United States either. So this is the kind of way that the Middle East was sliced and diced during World War I. And these various countries were brought into being, even though there was a strong feeling among intellectuals in the area that there should be one big, well, they thought of it as an Arab country. Now, we can talk about whether or not it was completely legitimate to be talking about Arab domination of that, because it's a very, very diverse region with many different religions and sort of nationalities of one sort or another. So in examining this process, we cannot say these were the good guys completely and those were the bad guys completely. I'm opposed to that kind of thinking. And that is true of the axis of resistance too. The axis of resistance is an expression of an opposition of some of the people in the region to imperialism. But it's not a pure form of politics of the sort that we might prefer. And where is the politics that we might prefer? Apart from you and I, Tedros, there's not too many people who we can certify that represents the very best political intentions, especially when it comes to ruling over large areas. So this is a fluid. The axis of resistance is at one level a symbol of the pushback of the peoples of the region against foreign rule and imperialism. But it's a mixed bag because it represents different religious currents, and those currents are not always friendly towards other religious currents and so on. So
Right.
we have to admit that we wouldn't necessarily want to live under the rule of some of the people, some of the movements that are part of the axis of resistance. The axis of resistance over a period of time, and I should say that it's quite a fluid entity. I mean, this is not it's not a state. It's not a very particular religious tendency either. And therefore, what would it mean if the axis of resistance should come into ruling a particular part of this neighborhood? And I think the answer is that's not what is happening here. It's a
Excellent.
pushback. It's a pushback. It's a pushback we understand. We can even endorse the resistance to this global imperialism of the United States, but it's not our place in a way to be saying that we hope that they would triumph or whatever. They've been resisting, but what is happening today? That's the interesting question that we might ask. What's happening? Is the axis of resistance actually succeeding to push back against the United States, Israel, other interested parties, the United Kingdom, and so on? And I think the answer is, well, yes and no. I mean, they have been able during a period of time to push back, to stop, for instance, the Israeli military from taking over big swaths of southern Lebanon, pushing up into the Gaza, into the Golan Heights, and so on. That is a sort of military achievement. But the question I like to pose here is, what is the strategy for a broader political resistance to the empire? And that's a very hard question to pose, because we need to be aware that the United States has a global empire. It has lots of satrapies. It has lots of other states that follow its lead, or that accede to its pressures and so forth. It brings all kinds of pressure all across the globe. And the Middle East is one, or Western Asia, by the way. That's a nice, I'm kind of leaning towards using the term Western Asia rather than Middle East, which is a colonial expression. But it's used in Arabic, Sharq al-Awsat, and so it hasn't yet fallen out of fashion. So Middle East from what? So it's West in Asia and East from New York and London. So, but it's hard.
As I expected, your analysis was going to be quite distinct. It already is, because as you know, the American news media, the corporate media, has a tendency not to think in terms of class. How could it be? Because it's an articulation of class interests itself. So the axis of resistance, correct me if I'm wrong, hides a subterranean class dimension to the composition of the resistance. It's as if there are no differences between the interests of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Syria, Iraq, and the class dynamics inside them. This reminds me very much of the hollowness of identity politics in the US. Identity of what? An identity that is not grounded in class, but strips identity of class so that it could speak vacuously. Your analysis, on the other hand, is respectful as far as it could of the politics of the axis of resistance. But unlike what we get from the news media, you're particularly sensitive to the class dimension. There are class interests that are going to come back to haunt the Middle East, as it were, or Western Asia, to use the term that you're using, after the first component of the liberation is realized, namely ending the war. And then what?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, this war, first of all, we ought to say that although this is a day of celebration and a day of great hope that some of the terrible war that has been besetting the people of Palestine and Lebanon and for such a long time, that this may be moderated, let's say. I hate to say ended, because there have been other occasions when various military operations have been ended, only to begin again right away. And the United States, we notice, is always the honest broker, or claims to be the honest broker. This is no more honest broker than it was when Britain and France were drawing, pencil marks across the map. The United States is there to ensure its interests and to ensure its hegemony. And of course, as you rightly point out, this is what I'm using here, these national categories that involve nation states. But we have to say that we're talking about the ruling classes particularly in the United States. And after all, where did the, great global oil interest begin in its modern form? It began in Pennsylvania, and John D. Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Trust that was set up. And by the turn of the century, that is to say, 1900, the Standard Oil Company had more naval ships than the U.S. Navy. How about that? Something that, now, of course, they were not warships, but that gives you an idea of the sort of non-national power of big companies and the way they operate. And certainly, oil is central to this discussion. We should remember that in the various battles over oil in the Middle East, when Mossadegh in Iran nationalized the oil company there that was owned by U.S. interests, it was owned, actually, excuse me, it was the primary interest in the oil in Iran was British at that time. And then the U.S. moved in right away. We don't need to go into all the details of that, but yes. The point is that the Brits brought in the Royal Navy. The U.S. Navy supported that with its own naval forces, and they threw up a blockade that made it impossible for the Iranian government of Mossadegh to export oil. This is the famous U.S. Blockages of trade that is constantly coming into the news. We see that one country after another is subject to this. So that's what they did then, and that's how we are to understand the on a class basis the unfolding of history in the Middle East in this period. But we also have to remember, as I was saying, there's a sort of two key elements here. One of them is oil, and the other is the geostrategic character of this part of the world,
Right.
where it's connecting up these different continents, and that is of immense importance. The British discussed it in terms of the British Empire when they were negotiating with the French over what part of the Western Asia they were going to take, and they liked along the coast there. And that was, of course, that was Palestine. So where do we go from here, Tedros? You have
All
to
right. No, of
give me
course,
a
what's
little push now.
remarkable is you've been engaged in this business of unmasking hegemony in Syria, in Iraq, and in the configuration of the passions and desires of humanity as it is coming out of irrationality, and as Hegel would add, moving towards rationality. You've done it all. And what you've given me so far does that extremely well. And now, my next question would be the following, if I can formulate it accurately, namely this. How would you characterize the differences and similarities between the way the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration are handling these gestures towards a very fragile ceasefire? Because the three stages are not lexically arranged. Logically speaking, I speak as a philosopher now, it is not guaranteed that the first stage would lead to the second, and the second would lead to the third, although under ideal conditions it should. But it appears as if the ceasefire is so fragile that once it arrives at the first stage, it might not move beyond that to the second and the third, which makes the ceasefire meaningless.
Well, I mean, the press, which doesn't remember what happened the day before yesterday, and the reporter who's writing the story probably was on the city desk until recently, and so on. So, I mean, where is Fisk when we need him? The great British journalist who had worked on the Middle East for such a very, very long time and knew all the history and all the where the skeletons were buried. So yeah, how are we to? The first thing I want to say is that in these negotiations that we've seen over the years, and in particular Camp David, Oslo One, Oslo Two, these the Israelis always wanted to have these agreements in a variety of different stages. And they're organized so that it's only in the last stage that you have something really serious that's going to happen. I mean, of course, ceasefire is important, but I mean, a ceasefire can stop being a ceasefire. It's not a permanent settlement of anything.
Correct.
So therefore, we have to look back at those things and say, well, why is it that this looks awfully familiar? And it looks awfully like those previous agreements that fell apart and left the Palestinians with very, very little.
Correct.
So I'd say that's it. And as far as the question of the two administrations, I have to admit to you that although, yes, I worked for mayor for a long time, we were always talking about this administration and that administration and its plans and so on. I've got a little tired of comparing these administrations. It's like saying, you know, which do you prefer, Nero or Caligula?
Correct.
So those for listeners who don't know, those are two Roman emperors. You probably guessed. So yes, I mean, empires are never, even Jimmy Carter, who everyone is saying so many good things about him. But and I won't go into the details, but Jimmy Carter was not doing good things as a president of the United States. He was doing marvelous things after he left office.
That's right.
And we take our hat off to him. He showed many people what a good life that is organized around real principles, what that might look like. But when he was president of the United States, he chose the most horrendous national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was, among other things, pretty much responsible for creating Al-Qaeda. The Russians came in with their army into Afghanistan to support a regime that was close to them. And then the United States thought the national security group in the White House and in Washington decided this was they could not allow this to happen. So they started arming and training and doing everything possible to promote a Islamic fundamentalist group, Al-Qaeda. And most people know what happened after that with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and all that. That's a reminder that they stop at nothing. And when they did that, the chief of the British MI5, which is sort of the FBI of Britain, wrote a letter, wrote a private memorandum to Tony Blair saying that our policies in the Middle East are the greatest threat to the internal security of Britain. I thought that came out later, and I thought that was very interesting because the peoples of these countries, these empires and satraps, are not profiting very much from. In fact, they are faced with the anger of people out there, and the terror is an action of weak parties who are trying to get some leverage over the political situation. So I thought that was very interesting that the lead internal security, the person in charge of MI5 came to that conclusion. Now, of course, Tony Blair, who was no great shakes himself when it came to the well-being of the people of Britain, rejected this. He said, well, we can't, we have our big projects out there, and we can't always adjust our international politics in the Middle East to this. But this is just guesswork and so on. Anyway, he wasn't ready to go along with that idea. But we should take note that even the head of a security service was saying this, and I dare say that probably people charged with security in the United States probably have told the President of the United States similar things. But it's never that. It's always the oil executives and the big interests that are driving this policy and saying, no, we can't. If we pull back from this, where would we be? We wouldn't have our
Hmm.
or inexpensive oil. I did a study at the time of the Iraq War of the
Yes.
cost of lifting oil, as they say in the industry, in the Middle East versus the cost of drilling for oil and pumping it out, say in the United States or somewhere else. The Middle East is by far the cheapest. You've probably never read about this in the
No.
newspaper, but um, they just you can put your finger down in the sand in Iraq or Iran, so to speak, and oil comes shooting up. it's
Incredible.
it's very, very cheap, and so of course the industry experts and anybody who works in this field knows very well that if you drill for oil in Alaska, which is very expensive because these huge rigs have to be up there and it's very cold and it's icy and everything. So to make a barrel of oil might cost I don't know, $40 or $30. I can't remember the exact numbers. Whereas in Iraq, a barrel of oil to bring it up to the surface, it costs about $1 comparatively. I'm making up those numbers because I can't remember. It's a while
Of
ago
course.
since I was writing this, but that gives you something of an idea of the
Indeed.
huge spread. Now, I always said to people during the discussions about Iraq, I said, imagine that if you were in the automobile business and it cost you so and so many dollars to make an automobile in Detroit or wherever you're making it, and then there was an island in the Pacific Ocean where if you made the same car, it would cost, you know, 1/25th as much. Now, of course, that's just a purely hypothetical, but it gives you an idea of how much battling there would be over that island. Now, of course, there is no such thing, but it that maybe helps to understand that oil in the Middle East is a gift to the companies, and they fight to get it, and they get their governments to fight for them and to send out troops and so forth, and to seize control of these areas. And in the Iraq War was very, very clearly about seizing back control. They had Britain and the United States had control of those oil fields, and then the Iraqi government, in its nationalistic fervor, took that control away. Now they weren't using it for the very well-being of their people, but that it did remove it from the grip of the Western oil companies. And the in the late period of Saddam's rule, he was a little bit worried about how things were going in Iraq. So he talked to um, the Chinese, the Russians, and the French about coming in with their oil companies for a bit of a share of Iraqi oil. So they were very excited. But Britain and the United States, because they'd been so nasty before, and there was a kind of ideology of this thing, were not invited to come back. And that was one of the reasons why people wondered why the vote in the UN Security Council was those three and those two. And that's the answer, because the three members of the Security Council, and that's where France left its usual buddies, Britain
Mhm.
and the United States, and went with those who were already cut in on the oil. It's a fascinating story, and of course, there's more to international affairs than oil company maneuvers. But when we see these things happening in such a blatant way, that helps us to really understand what's driving these wars and and all the terrible things that have happened. So it actually even turns out that this oil and gas off the coast of Gaza.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know, I'm not in a position to really assess the role of that. Of course, it's Israel's drive to ethnically cleanse this area uh, for Jewish settlers. And that's that. So sometimes politics is driven to some extent, or even to a large extent, by ideological considerations and settlement. In the case of the United States, driving the native peoples off the land was a very important element in the expansion of the United States of America out across the entire continent.
I I truly appreciate this nuanced and subtle analysis that my viewers would never get out of the popular news media. Because what you've done by way of answering my question about distinguishing the two administrations is essentially contend there are no distinctions to be made because the organizing principle is the search for oil. So when Trump contends that hell is going to break out in the Middle East until the ceasefire holds, the assumption is that what he and his predecessor Biden both are contending is that they are going to do what they must do in order to procure oil interests for the US and continue the hegemonic class project. That was remarkable, which would have to lead me to my final question, namely your own vision of what it is that must be done in order to convert this fragile, vacuous talk about ceasefire into an actual peace settlement, and what the role of popular movements could be in helping humanity to move towards this rational direction of avoiding wars. Your good friend, Victor Wallace, recently wrote a remarkable piece on capitalism and war that I'm encouraging him to blow it into a book with the one who introduced me to you.
Yes.
And I'm so grateful to him for introducing me to you so that we can continue this project of searching lasting peace.
Yes, well, Victor is a good friend and a very thoughtful and creative person. So I'm grateful to him for introducing us. So yeah, um, basically, uh, how do we move ahead? I mean, I think that's what is to be done.
Yes, the Leninist question.
Classic phrase. Uh, and and how do we get there? I think there's been a very difficult period after we had a world that was divided up among one huge hegemon and another smaller one, the Soviet Union and the United States. They weren't really equal parties, but they were the most hegemonic states. The United States was always the principal um, hegemon in the world system, especially after World War II, but even after World War One, the United States kind of rose to preeminence in the global system. And so how do we see the breakup of this one hegemon in particular? Because China is important, but it's not, and it's sometimes exercising some fairly interesting diplomacy. Can we imagine China? But I hate to put my bets on other hegemons because they don't tend to be very reliable, and they have their own interests. And so let's think about how we get to a more a politics based more on a popular base, a popular impulse in politics. And I think we have to ask even what is a state? What can we imagine a state, whether it's organized on a global basis or lots of small ones, can we imagine a state that is going to be free of class domination and war and so on? That's, as you well know, philosophers have been trying to figure that one out for, for a long time. And I think constant resistance from the people and that's an answer that is not an answer, but that it's trying to think about how we can how the world can be organized. I think that the biggest threat to the world is definitely not the war in Palestine. It's the collapse of the global environment. I mean, I didn't say that out of any lack of serious concern about the Palestinians. Of course, this is every right thinking person understands that that's a genocide, and that's just that was and is an expression of how brutal the world system is, and how brutal the world hegemons are, whether it be Rome or some other some other very powerful state. So people have to work together at different levels. These are the things that we must think about all the time, because working together with other people, perhaps through institutions like the UN that would have to be very improved and changed and not allow Washington to run roughshod over. These are the things, the creative geniuses that politically creative have to help us and provide leadership that's something other than what is provided by the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States, but also the various parties that rule in different countries in Europe and elsewhere. It's a period of particularly noxious governments that pretend to be liberal and democratic, but that in fact are providing us with an environment that is unspeakable, huge amounts of wealth that we've never seen before, but suffering on a global scale. So, will the people be prepared? The way I like to put it is, can you give up your ice cream in order to live in a habitable environment? And people say to me, you shouldn't say ice cream, you should say something not so. I say, I want to say something that people love it. But that's exactly the problem. I mean, it's ice cream symbolizes the feeling that people have that they need to satisfy their desires, yes, and that's more important than getting along with your neighbors or anything else. But we have to shake off I'm going to start anew right here and now. We need to have a program to get rid of ice cream.
This Jim, was a truly enlightening episode that I will remember, and I invite you to be part and parcel of my project by giving me some of your precious time once in a while when you are available, and give a report to the Kiros Report. This has been your host, Theodoros Kiros, for the Kiros Report with Jim Paul. The Kiros Report is supported by the Hutchins Center at Harvard University. And may I invite my viewers to consider subscribing to the Kiros Report so that I could continue to bring you a cutting-edge analysis of the kind that you just witnessed, principled, pristine, and simply speaking, brilliant. Thanks for coming to the Kiros Report.
Thanks for inviting me, Idris.